going to try and make sure I sort of stay within reach of this black fluffy thing here. Do you know what they're called? One of the names from it is a dead cat. Doesn't look much like one, but... So the theme for today is humility, and I sort of was thinking, well, that wasn't really where I sort of raced off in when I really got ripping into writing all this, but we'll see when we come to the end of it, sort of where humility comes into our approach to things. But with the reading here, there's some things in there that, you know, make you wonder a little bit. So when was the last time that we had any sort of quarrel here about what you may or may not eat? Anybody? We might have some people feeling a little bit uneasy about not having a church service on Sunday the 26th of December. Does anybody feel sort of, yeah, okay. So those special days and so on are something that's a bit of an issue there. Paul sort of starts, one of the things that he mentions very early on here is this idea of disputable issues, of disputable things. We know that there are many things which are not disputable, and Paul spends the first part of the book of Romans setting down exactly what they are. But I thought, to sort of help us to put this in something that we can understand, I thought I might get people to see if they can, you know, suggest some things, some issues within, well, the broader church, or in this one that would be disputable. Not matters of absolute doctrine, the core of the gospel, but other things that people disagree about or feel that other people are doing things wrong. And as one of the leaders in the church, I'm actually particularly interested to see if anybody can think of anything like that we have a problem with. But so, you know, what are some of the issues around that people get hot under the collar about? Yes. That number one is the style of music. Should we put the choir stalls back here? So? Since the 70s. Yeah, so the 70s is when music started to become a problem. No, if you look through history, it goes way, way back, right to the start. Whether there should be music, whether there should be music accompaniment. Everybody remembers the Gregorian chants where musical instruments were banned. Yeah, so music's a big one. Anything else? The audio system, yeah. Even whether we should have one sometimes. So that's infant baptism, yes. Yeah, so baptism and communion, the practices of the way things are that we're... I remember before I became baptised, I had to have an interview with one of the elders of the church, and this was an open brethren church, but the whole purpose of that was to make sure that I understood what it was that I was committing myself to. And what I got from George was an hour explaining why baptism had to be by immersion and nothing else would do. And that was all. He didn't care what else I believed in or did, as long as I had that one fixed right. Okay. Is it that one? Oh. All right. So I got baptism and communion in my list. We're looking at calling a woman as an associate pastor. So again, that's something that the role of women in the church is something that has been disputable right from the time of Acts, and Paul writes about things like that in ways that people at the time would have disagreed with, and people still do. Dancing. Drinking is another one. Yeah. What about, is it? Smoking? Yeah, that's there's a bit less about sort of saying, oh, you can't be a Christian if you smoke. Smoking is one of the, I guess, a more general sort of thing, but definitely alcohol, that sort of attitude towards it is something that become quite divisive in churches. Yes, I was going to put that one, I've got a little list here to prompt me if nobody comes up with it, but charismatic gifts, speaking in tongues, yep, there's a whole range of things like that. So there's plenty of issues over which people disagree, things that are disputable and can often cause real problems. And Paul, in this section, is addressing some of the issues around resolving a couple of those difficulties that specifically arose within the church in Rome. Now, last week, Roger, in giving the background to his sermon, talked a little bit about the structure of Romans as a letter and some of the issues that the church actually had. So you remember, as we've already alluded to, that the first 11 chapters of Romans are basically Paul setting out the doctrine or the gospel in sort of terms that the Romans can relate to and we all can relate to. And this is one of the great books in which what we believe is laid out in a sort of a fairly logical fashion, despite what Peter might have said about Paul's often confusing writing. It's actually quite clear. And chapters 12 to 16 that we're looking at the moment follow that by addressing some of those issues within the Roman church. And the two things that came up within those first 12 verses, one was to do with food and the other one to do with special days, feast days, or days that are used for celebrating particular things. And the food thing comes up again in the next few verses in more detail, and then this even more about the sort of weak and strong brother type of thing in the sermon in 2 weeks' time. So it's a part of something which deals with a whole range of stuff around there. So the starting point for this then is to go back and have a look at some of that stuff that comes in with the doctrine. I'm just going to choose one verse, and it's a really classic proof text, because what I'm taking is one bit out of the middle of something without giving you the context. But I think you'll forgive me for it when I tell you what it is. So this is in chapter 10, verse 9, and it says there, "If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." Now, that's a bit of an abbreviation, because obviously there's more that really needs to be added to that to just be amplified a bit to make it fully understandable. So we've got to say, well, who is this Jesus? Why was he dead? But it's actually a good encapsulation of the message which Paul puts here in Romans and elsewhere through his writings and through his teaching, that salvation or justification or being made right with God, however you might want to phrase it, is a result of faith and of faith alone. So just hear it again and just listen to what it says. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. There are no other conditions. There's nothing in there that says, and as long as you abstain from drinking alcohol, you don't dance, whatever, you choose music from before 1970, blat, 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 blat. None of those things are in there. There's no conditions at all other than that faith. That's all. And of course, there's a bit more, of course, to life than that. So we're actually expected to respond to that gift of grace, by living in a way that shows our love for God and for our neighbour. As James says, faith without works is dead. But it's faith, only faith, that's needed to open that door to the kingdom of God. So that's a message that Paul writes in that first part here. And now he's dealing with people who are putting other conditions or other expectations on what it means to really live out that faith and to be people of God's church. Now again, as Roger reminded us last week, the church in Rome consisted of both Jews and Gentiles. And the issue of how much of the Jewish law and practice should be required of Christian believers was in dispute, as it was in churches right throughout the Mediterranean in that early era. And the two aspects that are touched on in today's reading, the food prohibitions and the observance of holy days, I'm not going to deal with those directly. So the food again comes up later, but they're just examples of things that were important to that church, but are probably not really big issues in the current church. But I want to concentrate a little bit on the structure of Paul's arguments in these first 12 verses, and I'm not going to go through word by word and break them down, but just have a look at the way in which Paul constructs what he says to those people about the sort of principles about how you should deal with this situation. All right, here's a little sidetrack before we jump straight in. When I sat down and had a look at this, one of the things that struck me when I started to read the passage was the talk of weak and strong faith. So if you have a look at verse 1, it's something that I've read many times and are sort of familiar with, but hadn't really thought about it much until the other day when I started to put my thoughts down on paper. And it says there, "Accept him whose faith is weak without passing judgment on disputable matters." Does anybody see any bit of a contradiction in there? Something that jars a little bit? Isn't that saying that somebody's faith is weak in relation to some matter? When you say that, isn't that a case of passing judgment? Yeah, okay. So, and I don't think that Paul is being inconsistent in the way that he's done that, but possibly it's just that as it's expressed to us here, it doesn't quite make sense. I don't want to major on it, but this contrast that Paul makes between strong and weak faith crops up in several of his letters. It's usually in the context of things like the food laws, or circumcision is another one that comes up a number of times, where some in the congregation insist that believers should follow the Jewish law. And Paul writes a lot about that. And Paul regards their faith as weak because they're not convinced that faith alone is all that is required for salvation. And so he contrasts that with people whose faith is strong, and he counts himself among those people with a strong faith, who don't feel the need to add things, whether it comes from the law or from custom or from anywhere else, as requirements, that faith is enough. So this thing about weak and strong faith is not necessarily a matter of passing judgment on them, but of a disagreement about this core issue of whether justification is by faith alone or whether it requires some other kind of condition. So I think all of us here are probably, because we've heard it so many times and it's part of our history as an evangelical church, going right back to the Reformation, that the notion of justification is by faith and not works. We've got that doctrine right, and I think we all understand that and can quote that without any problem at all. But how about if we were to pose a question or say something in slightly different terms? How about if we came across the thing or attempted to say something like, you can't be a real Christian if you do this or if you don't do that? And this is not phrasing it in terms of doctrine, but it's phrasing it in terms of those expectations, those things that people do disagree and dispute about. And it's essentially the same sort of thing. And I'm not talking about sins of omission or commission, stuff that is a genuine sin, but some of those disputable matters that we brainstormed at the beginning. There's something to think about as a way of trying to give some context to this. It's not, when we talk about strong or weak faith or disagreements about things, are we putting expectations on people on what they should or shouldn't be doing in order to fit in as a Christian of the type that we think they should be or that we should be? But anyway, if we look at what Paul has written here, there's essentially 3 paragraphs, and I mean that, although it was written without paragraphs or anything like that, in the way in which we actually structure writing these days, we put things into paragraphs, each of which is based on a particular theme and has an argument within it. And I can see in here three of these that are sort of progression of ideas. So the first one in verses 1 to 4 is about acceptance, if you're going to think about a general term for it. And it can be sort of summed up or understood from verse 3, which says, "The one who eats everything must not look down or show contempt on the one who does not. And the one who does not eat everything must not condemn the one who does, for God has accepted them." It's okay for us to disagree, and we disagree about things all the time, and it's part of, we couldn't live a functional life if we didn't have disagreements and if we didn't have ways of resolving them and coming up with an agreed course of action, or to agree to disagree sometimes. But it's not okay to form a bad person, to condemn or look down on the person that you disagree with just because you have a difference of opinion. If they have faith, then God has accepted them and they must be respected, whatever. So that's acceptance, accepting people, not condemning them, even if you do have a disagreement with them. The second block of things, the second paragraph in verses 5 to 8, is about being sure of your own belief. And verse 5 says in part, "Each one should be fully convinced in their own mind." I am responsible for what I think and what I believe. I'm not responsible for your thoughts. I might disagree with you or try to persuade you, but I really have to be sure of myself and make sure that I know what I believe and why. And when we take a stand on something, it shouldn't be from prejudice, which is an opinion that is not based on reason or experience. Verse 7 says, "If we live to the Lord." Oh, wait on. Yeah, it does. "If we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord." So in becoming fully convinced in our own mind, our belonging to the Lord is the paramount principle, the thing that we start from. So that means we use his revelation, the Bible, as the starting point for what we should believe. Now, there are some groups like the Amish who don't use things that are not mentioned in the Bible, and that gets them out of a whole lot of problems, but it does leave them with a rather narrow kind of way of life. But we do here, obviously there's lots of things that the Bible doesn't talk about vaccination, for instance, or even wearing face masks or quarantine, all that. Well, it does a bit. But these are sort of, in our modern life, there are so many things where there's not a direct word in the Bible about how we deal with these things or what they mean. And sometimes those things can also be controversial. And the sound system is an obvious example. I don't think it's mentioned at all in the Bible, but it's something that we do need to deal with. But in cases like that, what we need to use our evidence of what's there and reason, as well as to deal with these things, but it has to be based on a sound understanding of what the Bible tells us is what we believe and what things are disputable and what things aren't. And the third paragraph in verses 9 to 12 reminds us that Christ is Lord and it is God's place to judge and not ours. So verse 10 says, "You then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you look down on them? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat." So although it's very tempting to judge, we love doing it, it's not our role. All of us have our shortcomings, and each of us will be answerable for those, but we're not answerable to each other, we're answerable to God. So this is the nature of Paul's opening argument in this section of the letter on differences of opinion within the church. We accept and respect those who have different views. We make sure of our own opinion, that it's firmly based and that we're sure of it. And we trust on God to do the judging. We leave that to him and not to us. Now, in those 12 verses, Paul used two examples that were causing trouble in the church in Rome: the food laws and the observance of holy days or festivals. And in looking for applications, I tried to think of differences that we might be dealing with in our own church. And although, we laugh about the music, but we managed to get our way around that and come up with something that's broadly acceptable. But most of the things like that I see at the moment are fairly trivial, and they're things that are being resolved with grace and with good humour. And generally I think we do a pretty good job of resolving conflicts within this church. Now, some of you might disagree, and I'd love to hear if there were disagreements, because as I say, that's the part of the leadership of this church. We need to know if there are problems and have ways of dealing with it. But I don't sense anything that's really causing us terrible trouble at the moment. But that, of course, may change. As a church in the past, we've negotiated a number of issues that have caused division in other churches. And two examples that come to mind of things that we've been able to handle quite well that have been quite divisive elsewhere are open membership. And that's where we changed our constitution so that we accepted into membership people who hadn't been baptised by immersion as adults, despite being a Baptist church. And the welcoming of women into eldership, into the pulpit, and into other roles here, which many other churches wouldn't accept. But before we get too complacent and pat ourselves on the back, there are things that we haven't handled well and which have caused major problems and have hurt people. And those of you who have long memories or have been here for a while will remember some of those divisions in the past. And two that have happened while I've been a member of this church over the past couple of decades were related to the proposal to buy the old Benvenue school site. And you have to look at David Bett's history if you're not familiar with that. And the other one was the issues around the loss of our youth group. And there are connections between those two in some cases. And both of those were cases where people were hurt, where a lot of people left the church, and where we were very distracted for quite some time from our calling, the things that we should be doing as a church that we encapsulate in our vision or our mission statement at the moment. And of course, if you look even further back than that, there have been other serious divisions. So it goes back to the split, which led to the establishment of the Chapel Street congregation, about which I'm still ignorant as to exactly why that happened, but it was so long ago it probably doesn't matter. And of course, Chapel Street themselves have had serious problems recently. So I think that we're doing well at the moment as a church, but there's plenty of warnings from our past and from other things that we can see around us that disagreement and division can arise at any time. And we need to be prepared to deal with those. And there are plenty of things here in these 12 verses to enable us to do that. Now, I said that this does actually relate to humility. And I think that one of the ways of seeing how humility becomes a really important part of understanding how we interact with each other in a way that honours God and enhances our service to him is probably to turn the order of Paul's argument around the other way and start from the top and work down. And so if I was writing this like that, I'd probably do it like this. So first of all, I'd start by saying, remember whose followers you are and why you are here. And that is the ultimate humility, of course, that God is sovereign and the one to whom we will give an account. So it's not about us, it's about God and our relationship with him. As a church, we exist to serve him and to glorify him. And remember that Jesus didn't tell his followers to build churches, but to make disciples. And that's what we're about, building ourselves up as disciples and bringing other people into discipleship. It's not about sort of things that, structures or things that we might hold as important. It's about relationships from God to his creatures, to us. And the second part of the middle part of the argument that Paul puts is that we need to be sure of our beliefs and our opinions. The problems that Paul was dealing with here were where people were adding things to the gospel, putting in extra requirements. But that's not the only way in which divisions between people, between the believers, can arise. But it does emphasise the need to be certain of why we take the side that we do. Is what we're wanting to do consistent with our understanding of the Scriptures? Is it the best way to fulfil that commission of making disciples? And a corollary of that is that we should be prepared to change our mind if we discover that our opinions do not have a firm foundation, that we need to be sure of things, but we also need to be open to being wrong and accepting that if it's shown that a contrary view is more aligned with God's will. And the last part of it is then we need to respect those we disagree with, and respecting others, again, is part of humility. We're not placing ourselves above other people. We're saying, you are my brother or sister. I respect you. I disagree with you, but I'm not going to, put myself above you. In the next part of the chapter, we're going to see that there's also an obligation of love to those people that we may disagree with, or people who may have a mistaken opinion, that we don't just say, okay, that's fine, you can live with that, but we also have to, you'll see next week, consider how we change our approach and our behaviour in order to be able to support them through love. And no matter what the issue, we can't break the commandments as summarised by Jesus, to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbour as ourselves. And none of that is about putting ourselves above other people. It's all about accepting that dominion of God, and it's about accepting the people that we may disagree with, or that we have to work with as our equals, our brothers and sisters, and show them love and respect. So there's my take on the first 12 verses of Romans 14. I think in many ways it's a warning to us that we need to be aware of when issues arise, that they will come and how we deal with them. It is based on that idea of humility, and I think it comes back down to that thing that as Jesus summarised those commandments about who we owe our duty of love to.